Yikes. Oh, that's a problem. All right, here we go, finally. Get handouts. Before we start, actually, I want to tell you that I've added a few more things to the Blackboard site. I don't know if people have been checking up on that or not, but under excavations, where you can look for pages that talk about specific sites, I have added links to pages that can tell you even more and have lots of pictures of Sepphoris, Bet-Shan Scythopolis, 2 sites for Bet-Shan Scythopolis, the synagogue at Chorazin, which we'll be looking at today. The synagogue for Beit Alpha I already put up. We won't be getting to it until next week, but I found a good site, so I just put it up. And if as I find sites that are trustworthy and full enough for other of the sites that we're looking at in class, I will add those. But anyway, you'll certainly find the Sepphoris and the Bet-Shan Scythopolis sites to be useful. So my question here is, how would you characterize Sepphoris? So you are describing the character of the site to a friend of yours that hasn't seen it. You are a villager of indeterminate ethnic or religious background who is just a simple farmer, agriculturalist person, and you've come to the big city and you've looked all around, and now you go home and you are describing the city. How do you describe it? You might want to take a minute and have a small chat. All right. So what do you say? Michaela? It's wealthy. Ooh, they're rich there. How do you know? Because there are large, ostentatious houses. So there's quite a bit of money. What else? Stephanie, what would you say? It wasn't a planned city. In what way? Not very organized, you say, because... Are you looking at the handout from the other day? Look at this plan. You're looking at your handout from the other day? So Stephanie and Lindsay meet at the village well, and Stephanie says, boy, you know, it's just scattershot. Buildings are all over the place there. There's no real plan to it. And Lindsay says, well, that's not what I saw when I went there. It was all planned very well. And then the third person says, well, did the two of you go to the same place? Sir? And so you infer what? Yeah. Oh, says Lindsay to Stephanie, you must have been in the old part of town where there's nothing impressive and nothing nice. Yeah, there's just a bunch of houses all over the place, and there's no real plan to speak of. But I guess you missed the good part of town where everything was large and gridded out and big streets with columns. Very, very nice. Very modern, you know, very au courant, very Roman. What else you got to say about it? Oh, these people are rich and very Roman. And, yep. Because? Yeah, you know, these people, they don't live like us, but they are like us anyway. They don't live like us, but they're Jewish. They observe rituals. All the houses have ritual baths. In fact, as we'll see next week, there's a big synagogue there, although in the first century there was no synagogue there yet, probably. Or anyway, not one that's been found. But these people are religious. Really? They're religious? I heard they had a Roman theater. Because? Yeah, all right, so the style of it may be Greek, but
They have very Romanized or Hellenistic mosaics and stuff as well. So it's not at all like the Jews that were in Jerusalem, where you wouldn't see, kind of stuff that was there. So they would have mosaics of other gods and stuff.
they have mosaics of other gods. Oh, my. What gods? Dionysus? What kind of nice Jewish person has a mosaic of Dionysus, for Pete's sake? What is up with this place? Who are these people? How do they live? How do you characterize them? How do you characterize this place? Iris. They have personal beliefs that are reflected in the architecture of their houses. They are, otherwise though, they look pretty acculturated. How does that, acculturation is a sort of jargony word. The politically derisive term would be assimilate. These people are assimilated. I hardly remember where they came from. Just grab on to the next fad. In what way have Roman attitudes or behaviors or styles been adopted?
Well, I personally think that a lot of the style and culture of the Romans was adopted. I'm not sure if all the beliefs were. If you look at the House of Severus, or the House of Dionysus and Severus, for example, you look at it and you'd say this is a Roman house because it's a peristyle courtyard, all this other stuff, but it doesn't function like one because it doesn't serve the same way, like the same purpose that a Roman house is. That would have been like that common word.
What purpose would that be?
Like receiving people and like being there to like impress. Like,
What aspect of a Roman house are you thinking of that conveys that quality of impressiveness and display, and also the setup for receiving people? What aspect do you not see here in the House of Dionysus?
I don't see like a big distinction between public and private. I see a more, when you look at the style of Jewish houses before, where they kind of have that central courtyard and everything's kind of mixed in together. That's more what I see is like a Jewish houses decorated with Roman style.
The style of the villa, the style of the Villa of Dionysus, it does not have. We haven't studied this in this class, but houses in Italian towns and including Rome have a public reception area when you first walk in, and if there is a courtyard with a peristyle, it's in the back, so that only people who are friends of the family or who have been allowed to pass through can enter it. This style of house, with a peristyle court as the main internal organizing feature, with all the rooms around it, including the dining room around it, is what style? Is it Judean? Where have we seen it? Delos. Where else? Tel Anapha. What's the style? What's the cultural association? Yeah, it's Hellenistic. Now, by this time, it's simply the elite style of house in the Eastern Mediterranean. It probably doesn't necessarily carry some cultural baggage, but it is also typical. Ooh, sorry about that. Maybe I should move this down. My volume seems to be up higher. It's also typical of elite houses. So not Judean houses. We didn't see any Judean houses in Jerusalem, for example, with peristyle courtyards. The typical Levantine house has an internal courtyard, but not with a peristyle, and does not really have any sort of public or guest dining room off of the courtyard, like Marissa, for example. So this is an elite house for the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not a Levantine, traditionally Levantine house. And the aspects of Roman culture that have been adopted are internal, largely. I mean, so they're inside the house, like the mosaic floor and the triclinium. The theater is almost a nod to the desire to have a large Mediterranean-style entertainment building, but it's built into the hillside in the convenient Greek-style manner. Not a lot of extra construction work or time or effort is put into making the grandiose architectural statement that a Roman theater makes, standing upright wherever it wants to stand. There are no other entertainment buildings, no hippodrome, no circus, no amphitheater. In the newer part of town, you have gridded streets, paved, colonnaded, so with shops on either side of the colonnades. We don't know what the character of the shops were. As we talked about last time, so far no forum or large civic gathering place has been identified. So it's a mix of some of the cosmetic affectations of Romanness, which is the cultural imprimatur of the day. That's the period that we're in. Those are the people that are in charge of the region. If you would go around to other big cities, that's the cultural overlay that you would see. But it's almost as if the people here have done some picking and choosing of what they want. And some of that is embedded inside the houses. Sepphoris was the wealthiest of the towns of Jewish Galilee, town, city, whatever you want to call it, probably a city. And it was also very famous. It was famous because it was the birthplace and home of one of the most influential rabbinic schools. After, well, even before the fall of the temple in Jerusalem to the Romans, there were schools run by rabbis who taught students Hebrew texts, ancient texts, the histories, the books that we know of today as the Hebrew Bible, and discussed aspects of those texts that were especially pertinent to how you live your life. And a code grew up, transmitted orally among these rabbis, that was a code of law. How should people act? How could we infer how the descendants of Israel and Judah should act in any given situation? And in the 2nd century CE, in this town, Sepphoris, was a rabbi who decided that this oral code that had now been going on for a few hundred years of collection and repetition was getting to be a little much for any one person to keep all in their head and should be written down. This long-standing code of rabbinic discussion of the laws that governed, by this time, Jewish life. And that code, as it was written down, was called the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H. And the rabbi who saw to it, who was the visionary, who said, all right, time to record what we have thought should only be spoken, was a man named Yehuda Hanassi. Judah, Yehuda, the prophet Hanassi. And he lived here in this town. His rabbinic school was in this town. But when he died, he was buried in this town, just a couple kilometers away from Sepphoris, a town called Beit Sharim, House of the Gates. That's what it means in English. And you can see Sepphoris up here on the map. Beit Sharim is just a little ways down the road in the hills. And you can see here in this very pretty aerial view the openings to one of the burial facilities at Beit Sharim. The site is carved out in these limestone hills, and they are catacombs. That is, they are underground burial caves, in the ground carved out burial caves. There actually was already a cemetery here at Beit Sharim. There was a village, too, on the outskirts. But after Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was buried here, this became the premier spot that Jews throughout this region and even places far, far beyond it chose to be buried. And it became, for a couple of hundred years, the largest and the most important necropolis, city of the dead, in the country. There are 14 catacombs and thousands of burial spots here. They are not really organized in any obvious or even unobvious way. People clearly could buy a single slot They could pay to have a small cubicle cut out. So here, this one at the top of these stairs. If you go in there, there are about 6 burial slots inside, and you have to, the ceiling is not much higher than this door, so you have to sort of crawl around. There's nothing grandiose about the insides of any of these places, and most of the effort was made on the outside. There are stone moldings, there are stone doors with stone hinges and locks, and there were knobs on the doors. And there are all sorts of modes of burial on the inside, from pit graves, graves that are just carved in the ground. Oh, that's actually a cistern. Here's a pit grave. To loculi, slots in the ground, similar to what you remember from the tomb of Epiphanes at Marissa. And the tombs around Jerusalem in the Herodian period have this. To a kind of resting spot, which clearly was a little bit more money, the sort of upper end, what are called arcosolia, which is, instead of sliding the body in vertically, you take up a lot more shelf space by laying the body horizontally, and then the upper part is carved in a rough arch. Inside either the pit graves, the loculi, or the arcosolia could be an ossuary, that is a little stone chest with bones that had been partially, the body would have been cremated, and then the bone residue would have been put inside one of these little boxes, and the boxes stuck in a pit or in one of these slots. Sometimes the burials were primary burials. The body was just put directly in. And sometimes the burials were in sarcophagi, stone coffins. And again, there's no real rhyme or reason to any of it, and it was almost certainly a function of price. Sir?
Were the burials restricted to only Jews?
The burials were not restricted per se, but all of the inscriptions that we have testify to Jewish names. There's no indication that anybody who wasn't Jewish was buried here. And Galilee in general, Galilee proper, Lower Galilee especially, was almost exclusively Jewish. All the villages are Jewish. This is not a period, and almost no aspect of antiquity is a period where there were rules about personal behavior. There was no civic entity to tell you, no, you can't do something. There wasn't, the concept of these civic regulations or zoning or anything like that. These are modern concepts. None of this existed. People just lived and worked and were buried in places that were traditionally part of their clan group or kin group, or the people that they felt associated with, and other people in other places. So these burials and the catacombs that you just saw, the sort of pit grave or loculus or arcosolium is already known from the Second Temple period outside of Jerusalem, and burial sites around Jerusalem, in Judea, in the first centuries BCE and CE look just like this. But in the later part of the 2nd century, after Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was buried here, there were a couple very elaborate facades for much larger catacombs. And this is one of them. This is Catacomb 14. What does this facade remind you of? Yes? Such as? Such as where? Jerusalem. Jerash. Right, triple arch gate. And what's really funny about this triple arch gate is, as you can perfectly well see, it's carved. There's a triple arch that's carved. This is stone. It would be way too much trouble to actually carve all of this out to make this be the entrance. So you've got this as a stage set, a total facade. This is the door. And it's, as you can tell, exactly tall enough as it needs to be, and not an inch or centimeter or piece of a cubit or whatever the measurement was taller. But like a triple arch, the central door is a little bit bigger than the side doors. And sometimes, as in this one right next door to it, Catacomb 20, there was just never any need came to carve a door on this side. So the arch clearly came first. And then and this was the initial way in, and when you go inside these, it is truly, and you can go, this is a great national park and lots of fun to go to, and you should bring a flashlight. It's completely labyrinthine, and there are hundreds of burials inside here, hundreds, and many chambers, and it's very cockamamie. You know, you sort of crawl into one hacked out space and then into another hacked out space, but there's no plan. And these two catacombs were the real estate cost the most. We're inside these catacombs literally hundreds and hundreds of stone and marble sarcophagi, including the sarcophagi of many of the members of the extended family of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So the closer you could get to be buried to this great sage, the better it was. Probably cost you more too. And that's why there continue to be these additional pieces added on and added on. Tom?
Is this the same idea of they put the body in a temporary place for a year until the bones were left, and then they put the bones in here? Or is that a different idea?
It is the same idea for the ones that are secondary burials. The question is this the same as in the first temple period and also in the second temple period, where we know burials, like for example at Ketef Hinnom, the burial place out just on the hill outside the city of Jerusalem, where the little amulet, the little silver amulet came from, and there was a receptacle underneath the stone bench, and 95 bodies had been found under that. And the idea in those kinds of burials was that there was the original funeral, the body was put there, but then a year or so later, or whenever more room was needed for the next inhabitant, sort of, then the bones would be, or the body would be taken out and thrown into this pit below, and then there would be room. There are no bone collection pits here. Once a body got put here, it stayed here. So there are no large group receptacles for burials, like in the First Temple period or the Second Temple period. But when we have a burial in an ossuary, that is a secondary burial. And many of those could have been of people who came from someplace quite far away, died, and then were cremated, and then just the small collection of their ashes and burnt bones were conveyed to Beit Sharim, and then a secondary burial occurred here.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Was this place totally looted out? Is that,
No.
remains still there?
Yeah. The Beit Sharim was, well, there was a certain amount of robbing that occurred in antiquity. As with practically all cemeteries, people at the time knew that there was a cemetery there. So most of the chambers were looted in antiquity, but then the site was lost It was actually, it got completely grown over, and nobody knew where it was. And it was lost for, probably 1,700 years. And in 1936, this is actually a cute story. In 1936, two shepherd boys who were playing and watching their sheep in the hills right around here saw a fox and were chasing it, and the fox darted down into a hole that they hadn't noticed before, and they followed. And they landed inside one of the catacombs. And that's how the site was rediscovered. And almost immediately, excavations started. And excavations went on for a long time and have been very widely published. And a lot of the sarcophagi, as for example the three that you see here, were found with remains intact. There are, like I said, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sarcophagi. This is just 3 of them, and you can see that whereas there are advertisements for Jewish affiliation, such as the menorah that's on this, there are also, just like at Sepphoris, a very casual acceptance of the aesthetic and symbols of Roman life. So here, for example, this garland with trees or columns that have sort of tree-like branches at the top, and then a bearded face, which could be a representation of Zeus or Serapis. Those are both deities that have beards. Pictorial imagery, like in the house of Dionysus, not clearly no problem, not considered to be a violation of the second commandment, thou shalt make no graven images, a commandment which seems to have been steadfastly attended to by Judeans in the Second Temple period, before the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. But in this era, with Roman culture like a tide that has just covered the land in a very relaxed way, not imposed by fiat, just there so that if people are interested in picking up any aspect of it, they can. And in that way, various aspects of it were picked up without, obviously, people feeling that imperiled their sense of who they were. So here, this sarcophagus has 2 lions. It has a bull's head, a bucranium. It has an eagle, another garland. There's a bull's head on the other side, or skull on the other side too, and also an eagle on the other side. So all of this pictorial imagery, which is very, very common in Roman art, both decorative arts and mosaics, and probably textiles and gems, and also on Roman sarcophagi. Although it's very easy to see from the style of the carving here that it was almost certainly local artisans who were hacking these things out. They apparently didn't measure all that well before they started carving. So things are uneven, not centered, sometimes missized. Like, you have to imagine that this might have been envisioned as being larger. This is how it came out when it got done. These lions are a little challenged anatomically. The eagle looks like it's going to have a problem landing. But you have to believe that the people who were doing the carving here hadn't seen or hadn't been trained in most aesthetically pleasing ways to go about this. Sometimes most people couldn't afford sarcophagi. Of course, sarcophagi were expensive. But some people had carvings, paid for carvings anyway, on the walls, outside the doors of the catacombs, or inside some of the catacombs. You can see some sarcophagi through the door here. A lot of the sarcophagi are still there because they're big and heavy and hard to get out. And a fair number of these carvings evince some attempt at evoking Jewish identity. So there are menorahs, such as this one, and this one. This, who looks like a weird space alien, is probably a man holding up a menorah, and he's dressed in a Roman military tunic. And the rest of his arms are gone. So that's why you can't see that he's actually holding it up. And this is probably the facade of, could be trying to evoke the facade of the temple, which nobody living at Beit Sharim in the 3rd century CE could have ever seen, or could have known somebody who could have ever seen. It was many generations in the past already. So it was just the idea of some fantastic large building being evoked. Doors, steps, columns in front, lions on top, and of course it's unlikely that the temple in Jerusalem had any of these accoutrements. These, including the shell ceiling piece over the door, are aspects of fancy Roman architecture. But to somebody living in the 3rd century CE, trying to imagine an elaborate temple, the only image they would have been able to bring forth would have been a Roman temple. To imagine a temple in the Roman period, the only image they would have been able to bring forth is a Roman temple. So that's what gets drawn on the wall. There are lots and lots, hundreds of inscriptions identifying the people who are buried at Beit Sharim. And they occur in Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Palmyrene, which is the language of Palmyra, which is about here, and even South Arabian. And they attest to people coming from as far away as Babylon, Antioch, and Apamea, up in the northern part of the Levant, South Yemen, which is it's actually down about there, Damascus, Beirut, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, the cities of the Phoenician coast, Caesarea, and then many of the villages of the Jezreel and the Galilee. The most interesting thing about this, when you think about that distribution, is that the center of gravity of Jewish life has moved north. It's no longer in Jerusalem. Jews are not allowed to live in Aelia Capitolina. Jews do live in the area of Judea. They live around Jerusalem. They live in cities on the coast. They live further south. They live in Egypt. But for this zone up here, it's as if, well, it is, that Jerusalem has become a concept. It's a state of, it's a sort of state of mind. Judaism is now a practice, and it's very, very emphatically no longer tied to a place. In this period, in the Roman period, in the Roman era, there might not be any political borders. Syria Palestina is one Roman province. There might not be any individual polities, but there are still different people. There are people who identify themselves with different cultures. And those peoples are not really any different than the groups of peoples that have been around for several hundreds of years. We have Jews in Galilee, now also living in Gaulanitis and in the area of Judea, and also along the coast. We have Phoenicians. People identify themselves as Phoenicians. We have Greek and Roman sort of people, or anyway, people whose main kind of identification is with the master culture, political and otherwise culture of the Mediterranean, living in some of the big cities, Jerash, Gadara, Scythopolis, Caesarea, which is this right here, Stratos Tower. So we have all these various peoples living in an area together, sort of side by side, and without the identifying comfort of their own political borders. But people, cultures, are, or certainly have become by this era in human history, hardwired to advertise some aspect of who they are. And that's an especially common thing for people to do when they live near by people who they consider to be of a somewhat different cultural group. And the way in which all of these various folks who are living all through this region, all these different peoples, start to do that is through the medium of religious architecture. So if you go to different villages and towns, you would not be able to tell from the houses, from the finds in the houses, from the layout of the town, who lived there, who shopped there, who they would have identified themselves as. But in cities and in towns, we start to get specific buildings for specific cults and religious groups. So one of the religious groups in this region so far are the Jews. And they've been up here for, well, a long time, since, about 900 BCE at dawn. But then again, in resurgence in the Hellenistic era, when the high place at dawn was renewed. Here's the synagogue at Gamla, town in the Golan. The synagogue dates to the 1st century CE. So that's one of the groups of people. Another group of people are those that worshipped at pagan cult sites, such as the Paneion, which is also up here, the sanctuary of Pan. And one of the things that's clear in the 1st centuries, BCE and CE, is that these sites are architecturally very modest. In fact, there's hardly anything to see at all. It's about what people did at these sites. There's no big effort at displaying anything for somebody else. That changes in the time of Herod. Herod, here at the sanctuary of Pan, right in front of the cave that was the locus of cult activity at the site, right here in front of the cave, Herod builds a temple dedicated to Augustus. It's a very modest temple, actually, 4 columns across the front, and it is served not only as a temple, but actually also as a kind of a doorway. Apparently you could get out through the back and into the cave, because it's built immediately in front of the entrance to the cave. Herod had a lot of reasons for doing this. This was another one of the structures that he built in honor of Augustus, but also, just as in the time of the Ptolemies, the Paneion site is at the edge of Herodian territory. And one of the ways that all throughout antiquity people marked the edges of their territory was by a religious structure, a structure that celebrated and marked the cults that characterized the people whose territory that was on the edge of. So this is the edge of the Herodian kingdom, and was already an established cult site. And to the cult of Pan, who was already being worshipped here, Herod added the cult of Augustus. Now Herod, when he died and handed off all of his territory to his sons, this part of his territory, this northern section, went to his youngest son, Herod Philip. Herod Philip received this enormous territory, and it was not too impressive. It was all these villages. There weren't even any large-sized towns except for Gamla. Gamla was probably the largest, and you couldn't call that a very impressive polity. So Herod Philip needed what everybody who's a king and has a kingdom needs. He needed a capital. He needed a city. And he built his city here at the site of the Panaeon. And he called it Caesarea Philippi. So his dad had built a Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the coast, and Herod Philip built a Caesarea of Philip, Caesarea Philippi. And the city that Herod Philip built is here in this flat area in front of the old shrine. So here's the cliff, and here's the cave. And you have to imagine the front of the cave with the Temple of Augustus right here in front. And down here in this open area, Herod Philip built a city. What do you have to have if you are building a Roman city? You have to have a colonnaded street. There's no good Roman city without a colonnaded street. You've got to have your colonnaded street, and here it is. I understand that this is one of the less impressive colonnaded streets that you will ever lay eyes on. It's a shame a Roman who might see this, but you can see the problem. All the columns fell over. Some of them got incorporated into later buildings. Sad story. But it must have been wonderful in its day. You also want a major temple. And probably you want your temple, at least one of them, to mark the edge of the territory of your city. This is a coin that Herod Philip struck. And you see a temple on the coin. Front steps, columns, the pediment on it. And that temple has probably been found on the hillside just about 2 kilometers south of Caesarea Philippi, which is itself right up about there in the crux of the mountain, or actually maybe it's there. But here on one of the hills overlooking the Hula Valley, at this site, Khirbet Omrit, is this very, very nicely built temple of the first century, early part of the first century CE. And here you see some of the steps coming up to it, and the lower course of the stylobate, some of the moldings. This is later, so you have to ignore this. You can tell it's later because it blocks this nice molding. So you can see the impressive stylobates, some of the capitals of the columns, and this is a plan of what that structure looked like in the first century CE at Khirbet Omrit. 4 columns across the front, big steps, high podium, Roman-style temple, just like the one that Herod Philip depicts on his coins. Now, with the city built immediately in front of the Panaeon shrine, and the temple that his dad built blocking the cave, which was the most famous aspect of the shrine. Josephus even talks about the cave. It was very, very large. Water flowed out of it at a great depth. It was very impressive. Herod Philip had a little problem because Dad had blocked up the most tourist-worthy attraction at the site. And so he built a kind of fake cave right next to it. There's this open-air court, and then this little fake cave that's carved right out of it right next to the real cave, so that if you come to the site because you've heard all about the cave, well, then you can see a little cave. You can make your offerings and leave your dedications, whatever. So you can imagine temple here, this nice, modest little open-air shrine with its fake cave, first century CE. On the 100-year anniversary of the city of Caesarea Philippi, so at the end of the 1st century CE, the beginning of the 2nd century, 98, the city was founded in 2 BCE. Here on the terrace, there's the cave, and here's the open-air shrine. Here on the terrace, right about there, was another magnificent temple. So all along the city of Caesarea Philippi, for 100 years, had just had the small temple that Herod Philip had built. So on its 100-year anniversary, they decided to add to the story. So here's the outline of the temple. Here's the cella, the main room, and then this is the front porch. And here is a reconstruction drawing of what the Paneion Terrace looked like in about the year 100 CE. You have this temple, which was dedicated both to Pan and to Zeus, which we know from an inscription. Nice Roman-style temple with 4 columns across the front, high podium, big steps. What's called an arcuated lintel. This was all the rage at this time because those old-fashioned lintels that just go straight across the columns, very yesterday, very boring. So this is much nicer, sort of jazzy, makes you feel elevated when you go up through the middle of the 2 columns. So it's just a nice touch. And then the shrine, the fake cave, which is right next to it, people started making additional dedications around it. They carved these little niches in the rock, and sculptures that have been found in the excavation, such as these heads, probably adorned statues that stood inside these niches. So this is a pretty fancy set of architectural markers for the city of Caesarea Philippi. 2 big temples, and sculptures and so on and so forth. And when one people makes a large fancy building, the other people who are in the area think, well, maybe we should do the same thing. They're not the only people who live around here. They're not the only people with some history. We are too. So the Phoenicians get into the act. The city of Tyre had its hinterland stretch pretty much all the way to this valley, the Hula Valley. You can see the highlands in this topographical map, and the highlands end right about there, and that edge is just about there at this mark between the orange and the yellow and the white. And right there in the 2nd century, here on the edge of the high plateau of the Galilee, looking out at the Hula, Omrit, the temple of Herod Philip is right about there. The Paneion sanctuary is right about there. So they're just across the valley from each other, right here. So right about here, on the edge of this site, the Phoenicians built themselves a nice big temple to their ancient deity, the god of heaven, Baal Shemin. And the site that the temple is built at is Kadesh. You're looking here at an aerial view of the sanctuary of Baal Shemin. There's a big courtyard in front and this impressive facade for the single cella, the single room building. You can see the back wall here and the sides wall, and there's one very, very large, impressive main door, and then 2 side doors. So 3 doors. The temple here is (58 by 66 feet), almost 18 by 20 meters, and the temenos, the area as a whole, including its courtyard, is 55 by 80 meters, 180 by 262 feet. The temple was very lavishly decorated because that's what people did. So in addition to these nicely fitted and carved paving stones. There were huge columns, and the columns had very beautifully carved capitals and anticaps, and the entablature, that is the horizontal piece that goes across the top of the columns and up to the roof of the surrounding colonnade. You see it here upside down, sadly, with its elaborate, extensive, and beautiful carving. Again, the front, the side doors would have been the doors that you could have actually gone into. The sill of the main door is raised very high so that you would have been discouraged from entering through the main door. So this is the situation up here in this zone where a lot of different peoples are living, and a lot of different peoples, those peoples have a lot of their own history. Down here at Kedesh, the new big temple to Baal Shemin. Up at the Paneon, the big temple to Zeus. Over at Dan, the very modest but very, very old high place. And over here at Omrit, the temple that had been built by Herod Philip, which is now getting on in years and perhaps looks like it could use some impressive addition, especially since right across the valley, the Phoenicians have built this temple to their very ancient deity. You have to have another way to show off. So some of these peoples can show off with antiquity. The Jews and the Phoenicians, very old. Baal, I mean, come on, Bronze Age. That's old. You got an old deity there. He has been around. The Romans don't have that kind of antiquity, so they have to impress with size. If you can't make it really old, make it bigger. So the temple at Omrit is enlarged so that it has 6 columns across the front, and the stylobate is the lower course is added to on either side. The entire facade is made more impressive by that addition. And you can just imagine how the Jews who live in all of these little villages are feeling about now. This is not good. I mean, look at this. So what are you going to do? Build something bigger. That's what I say. Build something bigger. Good idea. So in the various villages that are in this region up here in the north, that's exactly what happens. Inside every one of these small villages, Magdala and Capernaum and Chorazin, and a little village that's right up here called Bar-Am, the Jews build beautiful, large stone synagogues that look in their facades like the architectural language of the day. So here at Kfar Bar-Am is the facade of the synagogue, 3 doors, larger central door, arcuated lintel, temenos outside with columns. The size of the temenos and the size of the synagogue are almost identical to the size of the temenos and the temple at Kedesh. The Roman temples and the Phoenician temple had a lot of fancy architectural decoration, so this one has quite a nice amount of architectural decoration as well. Capitals are carved. There are very elaborate, sort of cushiony-looking lintel blocks carved in different designs. This one is over the smaller door that's on the right side, and you can see that there is a different design, a sort of vine and tendril thing. On this side, a little mask inside, some tendrils up here in the window on either side. Just, because that's what your town's most impressive building is supposed to have. 3 doors in, columns, a gathering place on the outside, lots of architectural carving, and then a colonnaded interior with the seats that went all the way around, a nice pieced stone floor in in the middle. So Baram, Kadesh, Dan, still, I mean, there are still finds at the high place at Dan from these periods, from the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th century CE. So people are still coming here and leaving dedications and worshiping. The Paneon, Omrit. This is not a landscape of conflict. This is a landscape of display. These people aren't mad at each other. They're talking to each other. They're talking to each other in the same language. Because if you want to talk to somebody else, you need to speak their language. And by this time, the language of Mediterranean and specifically Roman culture, architectural form, and decoration is not a problem, as we have seen at Sepphoris, for example. This is a world that did not impose itself, but was adopted, therefore, by the people who live here. So the taking over of these forms at these local synagogues, at these village synagogues, is of a piece with the sarcophagi at Beit Sharim with Roman decoration on them, the mosaic of the Villa Dionysus at Sepphoris. Here's another example of one of these synagogues at the town of Chorazin. Chorazin is a town that's a Jewish town that's been around for since the Second Temple period. If you believe that any aspect of the New Testament Gospels provide us with some information, valid information about this region, which is possible but not completely clear, since it's not completely clear where they were written and exactly when they were written, to say nothing of by whom they were written. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Chorazin is the author of the Gospel of Matthew attributes a slam about Chorazin to Jesus. Jesus castigates the inhabitants of Chorazin for bad behavior and living above their means. The town itself, only a piece of, just a small area of the town has been excavated. These two housing areas with this great big paved courtyard or piazza. The part of the town that has mostly been excavated is the synagogue, which you see here in aerial view. And here in plan, the plan is identical to the plan at Baram. 3 doors, big steps, internal colonnade on 3 sides. And again, elaborate decoration. Both the synagogue at Chorazin and the synagogue at Baram face due south. They face to Jerusalem. So you see here some of the columns and the lintel blocks still in place. And here, one of these lintels, there are grapes and vines, and the vines enclose little vignettes of people carrying things or treading grapes and working. They're still kind of eroded here, so it's a little hard to see, but figural decoration, which must have been seen by the people who came inside and worshipped here, specifically as that, as decoration, not as an attempt to harness the power of visual representation in a cultic way, but just as casual, the way we think of wallpaper, just some casual adornment, not meaningful in and of itself. So here in this wide-angle view, you get a sense of the impressiveness of the synagogue at Chorazin and the effort that was made by village planners to situate it so that it would have the same kind of dignity as one of these elevated Roman temples on a podium. So this is the natural bedrock, and rather than building the synagogue up on a high podium, as a Roman temple might be, the natural bedrock was co-opted. The synagogue was built on this high, naturally high piece in the town, and then this large set of steps was built down in front of it, so that it is naturally elevated in the center of town. All right. The Romanized, urbanized life of this region continues on for many hundreds of years, from the 2nd century CE all the way through the 7th century CE. And a city that probably provides us with the most impressive visual illustration of that is the city Bet-Shan, which was renamed Scythopolis in the Ptolemaic period, Bet-Shan Scythopolis. Bet-Shan, as a site, and you can see the ancient tell right here, is inhabited since the 5th millennium BCE. So by the time of the Roman period, that's something like 6,000 or 7,000 years. And in the Bronze Age, it was a strategic location of the Egyptian kingdom in the periods when it controlled this territory. Bet-Shan was captured from the Canaanites by either David or Solomon, depending on what aspect of 1 Kings you would like to believe about that. It was certainly part of the kingdom of Israel. It was destroyed by the Assyrians. It was refounded and renamed under the Ptolemies. In other words, it has and was well known to have had an old history. And when I say well known to have had, that's important. How would people have known anything about the antiquity of this site or the events that were purported to take place here in the Roman period? I tell you that they did. How do I know? All right. How do we know? Absent archaeology, how do I know some of the things that I just told you about the history of Bet-Shan? Lindsay? And what literary source would that be? Yeah, the Hebrew Bible. Where would people be hearing about the stories in the Hebrew Bible? In the synagogues, every week. At a Roman temple, there would be the occasional festival. You might come periodically and make an offering. In the synagogue, you went and studied weekly. And you heard a public reading of the Hebrew Bible every week, another chapter and verse, until by the end of the year, you would have, at the end of 1 year, you would have heard it in its entirety, and then you'd start all over again. Every year, all the way through, from one end of it to the other. And so, to the people living here, this is a place with a deep, storied past. And in the Roman period, and the Byzantine period to follow, a new city grew up, was built below the mount. So I'm standing on the mount, looking down at this city that is growing up around it. And we handed you out a plan, and on one side of the sheet of paper is a detail of the center of town. And that is this area right here. This is the center of town. So you can orient yourself with, the mound is at the top, and what's this? Theater. What number is it on the plan? Very good. Number 1. Okay. All right. So you can see immediately some of the features that you would have suggested, you did suggest, that Hadrian considered constructing in Jerusalem to make it a Roman city, such as colonnaded streets. What else? Theater. Colonnaded streets, theater. What else did you suggest? Forum. Yeah, there's not really a forum per se here. Although you did suggest that, that's true. What else? Bathhouse. What else? 3 arched gates. Yeah, probably there was one, but we don't have any of the gates of the city. We don't have them because they're outside the perimeter of the archaeological park. A temple, right? That's right here, at the intersection of the 2 main colonnaded streets. So here's one of the big colonnaded streets, and if you walk down it, you get to the Temple of Dionysus, who was one of the big deal deities for this town, and you can see that the temple had its steps and its forecourt made out of beautiful white limestone, which makes a very interesting contrast with the natural black basalt stone of the surroundings. So many of the elements that we need for a Roman town are here, and we will finish our brief tour of the site next time.